In the 16th and 17th century, you can find a lot of pamphlets about beached whales. There were about 38 documented accounts of beached whales in the Netherlands between 1520 and 1680. What we often see is that the whale will be harvested for their blubber and other resources by the local inhabitants. So it already was known by the Dutch what they could do with a whale. In the 16th century, the Dutch had a lucrative trade network on the Baltic Sea. Because of the profits gained from this, they wanted to expand the trade network to the spice trade in Asia. The only problem was that the route to Asia via Africa was dominated by the Portuguese and the Spanish. And the Dutch at this point would have been at war with Spain since the 1560s. So that's why the Dutch were looking for a northeast passage. They sent out 3 expeditions between 1694 and 1696. During the second expedition, a large jawbone of a whale was found by Jan Huygens van Linschoten on the island of Waigache. Later, during his wedding, he presented this jawbone to the city of Haarlem, where it still hangs in the town hall to this day. During an expedition in 1595, a whale of 9.5 meters was caught. This was the first whale caught by a Dutch ship in the Arctic Sea. The third and final expedition to find the Northeast Passage would be famous in Dutch history for the wintering on Nova Zembla. Because of these expeditions, the Dutch knew where to find the whales, but now we're going to answer why they needed to hunt the whales. Due to the rising population, more wheat was cultivated. Because of this, less plants were cultivated from which plant-based oils could be made of, like flaxseed oil, hemp oil, rapeseed oil, and linseed oil. Thus, the demand for animal-based oils from seals, walruses, and whales increased. Thus, the first Dutch whaling expedition was sent out in 1612. In 1613, the Dutch sent out 3 ships to hunt whales near Spitsbergen. On these ships were 12 or 13 Basque harpooners. In this video, the second video in our series about Dutch whaling in the 17th century, we're going to take a look at why the Dutch contracted those Basque harpooners to teach them how to hunt whales. The Basques were the first commercial whalers in Europe. The first mention of commercial Basque whaling comes from the year 670 AD, and they were already sending whaling expeditions to Labrador and Newfoundland in the first half of the 16th century. And from about 1540, these expeditions were no longer experimental, but commercially viable. And in the second half of the 16th century, the Basques were selling large amounts of whale oil in England and Flanders. And that's how the renown of Basque whalers grew in Europe. The Basques used large transport ships for their whaling expeditions. One of these ships, the San Juan, which sank in Red Bay, Canada, has been found. But the Basques didn't hunt from these ships. They mostly hunted from land-based whaling stations. And to actually hunt the whales, they used smaller, more maneuverable, quicker vessels called chalupe, which could either be rowed or sailed. In 1611, Basque harpooners were contracted by the English to teach them how to hunt whales. The Dutch and the French did the same in 1613, and the Danes followed in 1617. Mostly because of the competition between the English and Dutch whalers, the Basques were no longer allowed to hunt near Spitsbergen. This and the competition with other whaling nations meant the beginning of the end of the golden age of Basque whaling. In 1612, the first whaling expedition was sent out by the Dutch. This expedition was unsuccessful, mostly because of the English guide they had employed was not knowledgeable about the area of Spitsbergen or whaling in general. and this expedition was just a big waste of time. A year later, in 1613, they sent out 3 more ships on a whaling expedition, and on this whaling expedition they had 12 or 13 Basque harpooners. In our last video we talked about the Basque people and how they became renowned for their skill in whaling. And that's why a lot of European countries employed the Basque harpooners to teach them how to whale. But on this whaling expedition in 1613, they captured 1 small whale, 17 large whales, 13 walruses and 2 polar bears. And from this point onward, the Dutch harpooners would wear a particular type of boots, which they had emulated from those Basque harpooners from the first voyage. And the Dutch used these boots as a status symbol to represent their station as a harpooner. On the day of departure from Spitsbergen back to Amsterdam, the Dutch ships were intercepted by 3 English ships, and they had to give up all their cargo. Now, because of this, merchants from Amsterdam, Delft and Medemblik joined forces to start up a new company with the protection and blessing from the Dutch government. So on the 24th of January 1614, the Noorse Compagnie was established, or Northern Company. Whaling will be a seasonal occupation starting in June and ending in late October, early November. And whaling stations were built on the island of Jan Mayen and Amsterdam Island on Spitsbergen. The whaling station on Spitsbergen was also called Smerenburg or Griesberg in English. These whaling stations consisted of warehouses, cookeries, workshops, living quarters and fortifications. Because of the fear of raids from whalers from competing countries, there were multiple attempts at having a group of men stationed at the whaling stations throughout the winter, but this mostly ended badly because of exposure and scurvy. The most well-known of these stations is Spitsbergen because of the archaeological research that has been done at that location at the end of the 20th century. We know a lot about these men and how they lived and how the whaling stations worked. And this is also why the whaling station on Spitsbergen is the most famous of the Dutch whaling stations. The whaling station at Jan Mayen is less famous. It's also a smaller island. But in the 1930s, there has been erected a plaque on the island of Jan Mayen to commemorate the men who died there during the wintering in 1633. Because of internal struggles, the Northern Company collapsed in 1642, and from this point it was illegal for anyone to fund a whaling expedition to Spitsbergen. But before this point there were already a lot of independent whalers who hunted at sea and brought the unprocessed whale blubber back to the Netherlands to be processed there. Due to overhunting around Spitsbergen and the changing of the migrational patterns of the whales, the Dutch whalers started to hunt more on the east coast of Greenland. And so by 1660, the hunt for whales around Spitsbergen by the Dutch had already stopped. The 2 types of whales the Dutch hunted were the bowhead whale and the North Atlantic right whale. The reason for this is that they both have a pretty high fat percentage. They're relatively slow swimmers and they have a mild temperament. And because of this high fat percentage, they do have a tendency to float after death, which of course was handy for the whalers at the time. The Noordkaper, or North Atlantic right whale in English, the Latin name is Eubelina glacialis. The English called this the right whale because it was the right whale to hunt. They can reach a length of 14.5 meters till about 18.3 meters, with the females getting a bit larger than the males, and they can reach an age of about 70 years. The patches on the head of the whale and above the eye consist of whale lice and are unique for every individual. There are probably less than 366 individuals alive in the ocean today, and their numbers are dropping. This is mostly caused by declining food resources, collisions with ships, and entanglement in discarded fishing nets, and their low reproduction rate. The Groenlandse walvis, or also known as bowhead whale, Greenland right whale, Russian whale, or steepletop whale, among other names. The Latin pronunciation is Balenidae mysticetus. They can reach a length of about 20 meters, and research was started after the discovery of a 150-year-old harpoon point in the skull of a bowhead whale to find out how old these creatures could get. Scientists now believe that the bowhead whale can reach ages of above 200 years old, which makes them the most long-lived mammal on Earth. Their baleen plates can grow to be over 3 meters long, which is the longest of any whale. There are about 10,000 individuals in the Alaskan population and 5,000 in the West Greenland population. There are a few smaller populations that just number about 100 or a few tens of individuals. The native Inupiat people of northwestern Canada are still allowed to hunt the bowhead whale in the traditional manner. This is highly regulated, and once every few years researchers join them to do research on these whales, because we still have a lot we do not know. Both North Atlantic right whales and bowhead whales are hunted by orca whales or killer whales. You often can find bite marks on their fins or tails. After the orcas kill the whale, they only eat the tongue. This phenomenon was already witnessed by Dutch explorers in the 16th century. What resources did the Dutch gain from these whales? They got the baleen, the whale oil, and the whale bones. Okay, now we're going to have a look at what they could do with the resources they gained from the whales. The whale bones could be made into a particular kind of oil that it was said was good against rheumatism. The bones could also be made into a kind of glue, and the bones were often brought back to the Netherlands and used in towns where a lot of whalers came from as decoration, and were used for things like fence posts and things like that. The oil was used as general lamp oil, but it was also used in a lot of industries like the leather industry, the cloth making, soap making, candle making, the wool industry, and it was also used as a general lubricant. And for the baleen, there were a lot of uses for baleen. In the beginning of the 17th century, there wasn't as high a demand for it, but as the time went on, the demand grew. And in short, if today we would make it out of plastic, then they would make it out of baleen. And now we're going to have a look at a list of things they could make from baleen. The Dutch utilized two types of whaling. One was with kapitaalschepen, capital ships. These were larger vessels with larger crews, and a big part of the crew also worked the whaling station. These ships would hunt along the coastline near the whaling stations, and the whales would be processed on land at the whaling stations. The other type of hunting would be done with smaller, more maneuverable ships with more specialized crews. These will be classified as hunters or jagers in Dutch. And these would hunt on the open seas. These were also often called sea fishers. In the beginning of the 17th century, most Dutch whaling ships were of the flutes type. And you can always recognize a whaling ship by the large beam that's placed near the stern of the ship, that's used to hang the whaling sloops on for quick deployment. And you can also often recognize the Dutch whaling ship by a whaling flag. That's just a normal, typical Dutch tricolour flag, but with a whale in the white portion. The image of the whale can differ from ship to ship, and it doesn't seem to have been standardized in any way. In the second half of the 17th century, a new ship design came along for whaling, het bootschip, the boat ship. These had a broader deck than the earlier fluitschepen, or the earlier flute ships, which made it easier to process the whale and process the whale blubber on deck. And now we're going to take a look at the actual process of hunting and killing the whale. When a lookout from either land or from the mast of a ship spots a whale, he shouts val val, or fall fall in English. And at that point, immediately 3 sloops are deployed into the water. Each sloop is manned by at least 6 men, among whom 1 helmsman and 1 harpooner. These men have been assigned to their own sloop, and along the way from the Netherlands to the hunting grounds, they have trained with this sloop to be as effective as possible when a whale is finally spotted. They will row to the whale as fast as they can, but also as quiet as they can, because if the whale is spooked, it will dive under and it will escape. They also needed to make sure they didn't come too close to the tail of the whale, because one hit of the tail could send a sloop flying. The harpooner in the first sloop to reach the whale will throw his harpoon. The favorite spot to hit the whale was just behind the pectoral fin. Once the whale is hit, it will dive under. The harpoon is connected to a rope. The rope is up to 360 meters long. When the whale dives under and drags the rope down, it rapidly starts to uncoil and drags over the side of the whaling sloop. This goes with such an incredible speed that the wood on the space where the rope is dragged over starts to smoke and needs to be continuously cooled by the men in the boat by pouring water over it. There is always 1 man next to the barrel with an axe. He keeps an eye on the rope and makes sure it doesn't tangle, because if it tangles, he immediately needs to cut the rope. Because if he doesn't, there's a high chance of the boat getting flipped because of the force at which the whale is dragging the rope down. And he also makes sure that the rope is not running out. If there's a chance of the rope running out, there's a sign given to one of the other sloops that will give their line to the first sloop. When a whale dives down in a panicked state, like when it gets hit with a harpoon, it can't stay down long, and it has to come back up to get air relatively soon. When it comes back up again, the sloops start chasing the whale again, and a second harpoon is thrown. Then it dives back under again, and when it comes back up, no more harpoons are thrown. Now they start throwing whaling lances. There are 2 types of whaling lances. You have throwable whaling lances that are like the harpoon, but without the barbs. These parts are the barbs that make sure that the harpoon sticks inside the whale. They're also connected with a rope, so they can be thrown and they can be pulled out and dragged back. There are also stabbing lances. They are used when the whale is tired out, and the sloops can get right up to the whale. These are stabbed deep into the whale, as deep as they can. They are moved around, and when a mixture of blood and water comes out of the blowhole of the whale, then the sloops take distance. because then the whale starts to convulse and spasm, and then it's at its most dangerous to the sloops, and then it slowly dies. When the whale has finally died, they will tie the sloops end to end with a piece of rope and slowly drag the whale back to the whaling station or back to the ship. If they need to row for a long distance, they will cut off the tail and the pectoral fins to reduce drag. In this case, I'm going to describe how the whale was processed first on a ship and then brought to the whaling station or back to the Netherlands. If a whale was caught near a whaling station, all these parts would be the same, only the processing and the cutting up of the whale will be done on land. When the whale has been dragged back to the ship, it will not be processed immediately. Just after dying, the whale will float just under the surface of the water. And within a period of 3 days, the whale will start floating higher and higher on the water. Some say even so high that on the 3rd day you could step from the deck of the ship onto the whale. If they wanted to keep hunting within this period, they would drag the whale behind the ship. And if they wanted to process the whale, they would tie the whale at the side of the ship. The speksnijder, or fat cutter in English, often wears leather clothing to keep the whale fat from seeping into his normal clothes. He also wears spekijzers. These are metal spikes that can be tied under his shoes or boots to keep him from slipping off of the whale. He uses a particular kind of knife, in Dutch called een flensmes, to cut off strips of fat from the whale of about 300 pounds. And on a ship, these pieces of fat will be hoisted off of the whale onto the deck, on which most of the crew will be waiting with spekmessen, with fat knives, to cut the whale blubber into smaller chunks. These chunks will be stored in barrels in the hull of the ship. These could be taken to either a whaling station or back to the Netherlands. The Dutch did not render their whale fat into oil on board of their ships in the 17th century because of the fire hazards. Apparently the French did render their oil on board, which often seemed to lead to ships burning down. It took till the 18th century that the Dutch started to render oil on board of their ships. Whale blubber could be rendered into whale oil at whaling stations, like on the island of Jan Mayen, or at Smerenburg on Spitsbergen, or back in the Netherlands. At these whaling stations or back in the Netherlands, there would be cookeries with boiling houses, with big metal cauldrons filled with water. In these cauldrons, the blocks of whale fat would be boiled. The fat would melt and float to the top, and the impurities would sink to the bottom. Then the fat that floated on the top of the water would flow to another reservoir where it would cool, and there even more impurities would sink to the bottom. This process could be repeated a couple of times until the oil was as pure as it could be. It seems that the crews on Dutch whaling ships, especially the hunters with smaller crews who hunted on the open ocean, had a sort of flexible occupation. Like the harpooners, who differentiated themselves from the rest of the crew by their boots. When there were no whales to hunt, they would just do the same work as the rest of the crew. They would just have their normal station next to being a harpooner. Some experienced commanders, because Dutch whaling ships, they weren't called captains, they were called commanders. Some experienced commanders would also be harpooners or helmsmen on one of the sloops. And also harpooners could often, because of their experience, also be speksnijders or fat cutters in English. or just help cut the fat on board, because in every facet of the whaling profession, they just needed to be as efficient as possible with the whole crew. So everyone always had work to do. With the kapitaalschepen who processed the whale on land at the whaling stations, the harpooners had a bit more freedom because there were more men to cut up the whale blubber and everything like that. At the stations, the occupations were more separate than on the hunter ships. Well, this concludes our series on Dutch whaling in the 17th century. I hope you liked it, and if you have any questions about any of our videos, please leave a comment. We really appreciate you watching our content. And now we're going to look at a coin spin.